Looks like I have boobies painted on, but it's an Autechre t-shirt. Hi-Fi preferences come in endless forms. Some swear by coaxial drivers, or some swear by monstrous power amps, and some swear by super low power tube amps. Some swear by vinyl, some swear by non-oversampling DACs, some swear by battery power to isolate the system from the grid. Some swear by omnidirectional speakers, some swear by headphones, some swear by silver cables, and the list goes on and on and on forever. And all of those things grant you some qualities while they impose a performance glass ceiling in some other way. Some, understandably, roll their eyes at all of this and are already on their way to skip ahead to my listening impressions because, of course, that's ultimately what matters. But if you are someone who can't stand all the techno babble and hi-fi reviews, well, first of all, you have my sympathies, but let me at least try to explain how you will be able to make a more informed choice if you understand the technical justifications for a product's design decisions. I don't think there exists a hi-fi system that is always perfect, one that is the ultimate choice in the pursuit of musical pleasure, regardless of one's mood, music, or context. So even with an infinite budget, buying a single hi-fi system comes with inherent and inescapable compromises. The challenge isn't to find things that sound really good, a lot of things do, but to figure out what compromises interfere with enjoyment the least for you and over the long term. The Grimm LS1cs are in many ways an assault on compromise, an effort to do away with as many performance glass ceilings as research and engineering allows. Whether that makes these speakers the ultimate choice in the pursuit of pleasure is what I've been trying to figure out. A good chunk of the LS1 series' fundamental design was originally by Bruno Putzais, who later left Grimm to instead build speakers under the Key brand. My first review on this channel was of his first speaker there, the Key 3, so this review series of active speakers sort of come full circle with the Grimm LS1s. The first LS1, so Loudspeaker 1, came out about 16 years ago now, and after Bruno's departure, Grimm has kept updating the design with new components inside and out. They currently have 3 versions in production: the original updated LS1 version 2, the more affordable LS1A, and the flagship LS1c that I have here, which replaces the LS1BE. The C stands for carbon, as in the tweeter's material, while BE stood for beryllium, which is increasingly difficult to source, highly toxic during processing, and according to CS, who made those drivers, just not worth it anymore. But even beyond that, the LS1c actually come in 2 versions. This is the fanciest one, where the enclosure is made of a material called Himax, a synthetic non-porous stone that is far stiffer and heavier than MDF or bamboo, and that also allows them to make the baffle much thinner in places without risking resonances. This is why on the Himax version, the mounting screws for the woofer are covered. This is what it looks like when they're exposed in the non-Himax version. Grimm's CEO and namesake Elko Grimm tells me that covering the screws and reseating the drivers ever so slightly into the baffle adds a tiny but measurable improvement in the speaker's performance. Opting for the Himax material adds an additional €6,300 if you're okay with this white version, bumping the price of the LS1c from the baseline €25,700 to €32,000. For non-white Himax finishes, the price addition is another €4,000 for a total of €36,000. I don't have a non-Himax version to compare with, but even if sonic differences are minimal, which they may or may not be, some people would likely be willing to pay for one of the more exotic finishes that Himax offers. As a two-way system, they're specified to reach 35 Hz at -3 dB, which is comparable to many high-end bookshelf speakers. Stereophile's measurements, linked in the description box below, saw -6 dB at 29 Hz. You can change the low-end cutoff frequency in the settings, which lets the speaker play lower frequencies, but pushing these 8-inch woofers into sub-30 Hz territory at anything approaching normal listening levels will lead to distortion, which I will be talking about later in this video. You can also add subs, extending the system from a 2-way to a 3-way design. They come in either the LS1s model, which I'll assume stands for Loudspeaker 1 sub, at €8,500 per pair, or the more recent, better measuring, and more expensive SB1 at $13,000 per pair, which are the ones I have here for review. They can be identified by this copper trim on the dust cover lid. You can also add any third-party sub you like. It's an XLR connection and nothing proprietary. With the subs, the speakers are said to be linear to 20 Hz in room, and as the woofer now gets rolled off at 70 Hz, the system becomes capable of higher SPL, sound pressure level, and less distortion. The Pro audio origins are evident in that connections are all on XLR, both analog and digital, as well as subwoofer out. They come with a nice RCA to XLR cable though, so that you can more easily connect digital sources that lack AES over XLR. Like with the Key 3, and again showing the shared DNA via designer Bruno Putzais, the speakers connect to each other via an RJ45 cable, but it uses a proprietary protocol, so this is not an Ethernet port. This shipment also included a dedicated external source, the Grimm MU1, which is the digital-only older sibling to the MU2 streamer and DAC that I bought last year. While the MU1 works well with other DACs in a traditional system, it was designed primarily for these speakers, and it too connects via RJ45. You don't need the MU1, you can use any source you want, but it allows for a simple web-based interface to control settings on the LS1 speakers, and it's just a phenomenal streamer. But you can also reach the speaker settings, and in fact more settings, by using the included RJ45 to USB cable to run the Grimm control software on your Windows or macOS computer. This gives you access to additional settings like Pro audio monitoring configurations. If you don't want the MU1 or can't afford or justify its €12,750 base price, you will need some other way to control volume and source selection. Unless you have a preamp or DAC that can handle this already, Grimm also makes the LS1R remote, which solves that and provides 2 additional AES digital inputs. This seems to me like an ancestor of the key control, which improves on the LS1R by adding Toslink, SpeedIF, and USB audio inputs, as well as support for infrared remotes and control over many DSP features. I did not have an LS1R available for this review since it came with the MU1 instead, but the remote adds €1,700 to the price. And speaking of price, the MU1 here is equipped with a 2TB drive, which costs another €400. Thus, the total system price as reviewed is $25,700 for the speakers, plus $6,300 for the high-max material, plus $13,000 for the subs, plus $12,750 for the MU1, plus $400 for the drive internally, landing us at €58,150. Thus, I have to very reluctantly accept that I am reviewing a system that simply isn't within reach for me financially. And that matters because I try to take on the perspective and mindset of a potential buyer in my reviews. Doing so requires more imagination on my side when the price tag is this high. So what I'll do in this review, which I haven't seen done in other reviews of these speakers, is to treat them as the modular system that they are. This means I will evaluate the standalone speakers without subs first, and then upgrading to subs, and finally upgrading to the MU1 as a source. Okay, here comes the very technical section, but even if you normally hate those, please give this one a chance because I think it is super valuable for not just learning about these speakers, but about speaker design in general. Low frequencies are practically omnidirectional, meaning they radiate equally in all directions from a speaker. Where this changes in frequency and stops being omnidirectional and becomes more directional is influenced by the size of the baffle that the driver is mounted into. The narrower the baffle, the shorter the wavelengths that are able to bend around it. Psychoacoustic research tells us that us humans are not very sensitive to this directivity below 250 Hz or so, which means a baffle that fosters good directivity above 250 Hz is desirable. This means that you want a baffle width of about 50 centimeters or more, so 20 inches, and as it happens, that's what the LS1s are. Sounds are pressure waves in the air, and as these waves expand, you can think of them as hemispheres coming out of the speaker. And so as it expands outwards, it reaches the cabinet edges. If those are sharp and angular, this creates diffraction, a sort of secondary wavefront that is temporally, so in time, slightly behind the direct sound, because sound moves slowly, so the direct sound goes forward, and then the edge of the wavefront at the same time travels sideways across the baffle, reaches the corner. That creates the diffraction, which sort of emits a new wavefront. But this one, and now the direct sound has gotten further before this one gets going. So that's what I mean by temporally behind. So in time it is behind. This creates frequency-dependent cancellations and summations of sound. So waves either add up to a higher wave or a wave peak and a wave bottom cancels out into nothing. And this compromises spectral linearity, so you want sound to be equally loud across the spectrum, but now you get weirdo comb filtering, as it's called. And the phase smearing, so phase is how they are aligned in time, the temporal alignment of the wavefronts. That can be heard as a reduced sense of sort of voluminosity or airiness and things like that. And the wider the baffle, the more out of phase the diffraction is, because it has to travel longer before it creates, longer in distance and longer in time, before it creates that secondary wavefront. And so a wider baffle thus negatively affects stereo imaging because you get more of that phase smear. If the edge is instead rounded and a bigger radius affects lower frequencies, those kinds of diffractions never happen. This is also why on the LS1 speakers the tweeter is below the woofer so that the top can remain flat for aesthetic reasons and the bottom edge is rounded for acoustic reasons. These artifacts don't always manifest very clearly. They can be difficult to identify since you can't toggle corner rounding on and off. And as I'm sure you've heard, many rather boxy speakers provide excellent and satisfying sound, so the edge rounding is clearly not a prerequisite to make a speaker enjoyable. But in the pursuit of technical perfection and armed with an understanding of these phenomena, I suppose it becomes difficult to argue for anything other than rounded corners. Seen from the sides, the LS1 is a very shallow speaker. This is to ensure that lateral resonances happen way above the crossover frequency for the woofer, so where it leaves off sound duties to the tweeter. This is an unusual but not entirely unique design. There's also speakers like the avant-garde Zero Itron, the Sonus Faber Stradivari, and more. All in all, the wide and shallow and rounded body means that the sound's directivity from these speakers is very consistently wide but controlled above 250 Hz. This means that sidewall reflections don't cause much of a spectral tilt, unlike a speaker that maybe has more sidewall reflections at 500 Hz than at 700 Hz. With those, you'd get a very different spectral balance depending on the toe-in angle of the speaker. Not so here. First reflections aren't automatically benign with these speakers though, as they can cause time smearing, which again we don't want for sound staging and so on. But if you toe them in aggressively to cross in front of the listener, the wide dispersion means that the listening position still gets a perfect spectral response, but with sidewall reflections heavily attenuated for super precise stereo imaging while maintaining spectral linearity. The legs are factory calibrated to each speaker to iron out any variations in driver performance and attached magnetically before they're secured with a simple thumb screw. They then attach to the very heavy foot plates. The subs are primarily designed to be placed on those plates and are held in position magnetically, but the fit isn't 100% snug. This might be deliberate to avoid rattling between legs and subs, but if you have a lot of OCD, you're going to see that gap and go, ugh. So toe them in and you don't see the gap. The subs can be placed anywhere though. The included cables are short to keep it tidy when used as intended, but if a room requires it, you can move them around and time align them accordingly in the settings. I left them on the stands throughout this review. These speakers aren't explicitly made for near-wall placement like the prior three in this series, but they are said to work well close to boundaries. I first tried them with about 30 degrees toe-in and planned to try 45 degrees in short order, but there's so much happening here that I just sat transfixed for the first couple of weeks of listening. The settings menu has presets for 30 and 45 degrees that adjust the EQ ever so slightly to fit those positions, but you can choose any arbitrary number. Once I did get around to trying 45 degrees of toe-in, I got even more coherency in the sound since it minimizes first reflections further. They're at about 30 degrees or maybe even less now behind me, but that's just because it looked better on camera. And as usual in this room, I prefer speakers about a meter or more out from the back wall. This also gets me closer to an equilateral triangle for the listening position. In the settings, you can also tweak the tone curve in the bass and treble. You might want to bump the bass 1 or 2 dB and dip the highs similarly, which I did for a while, but the vast majority of my listening was done with the curve flat. You can also set the low cut point to let the speakers play a little deeper in the bass, but depending on the music and your playback volume, this can stress the woofer to the point of audible distortion. So finally we get to listening, but I hope you can see how all of that tech talk is important to understand what these speakers are about. And if you skip straight to this section, welcome, I guess. Now, normally I don't take notes for the first several days of listening when I'm reviewing, as I just want to soak in the sound for a while first. But in the first like 40 minutes with these speakers, I'd written probably a full page's worth. That started with the first couple of minutes where I wrote in all caps, "The clarity, what the actual f." There is a degree of resolution here, not artificial sharpening and not spectral tilt and not distortions masquerading as texture, but true sonic information from the recording that makes me think of like videos of kids getting corrective glasses that lets them see their parents clearly for the first time. I've always been drawn to sound with lots of resolution because in my love of sound, texture is so crucial, and without sufficient resolution, all textures smear into a dull sameness. This preferential compass has made me favor super controlled and precise sounding equipment over gear that sounds more like extravagant and flamboyant. With time though, these preferences have mellowed slightly, and I have always loved vinyl, whose flavor of textural precision is indeed a little bit more organic. But even with these preferences, and still after more than a month of listening for many hours every day, I still feel like these speakers lean a little bit on the cold side, certainly compared to the last couple of speakers I've had here. Now, it's not a hostile coldness, not one derived from nonlinearities or distortions. It's rather an almost overwhelming correctness and sort of integrity to the presentation, if you can even imagine what that's like. And I suppose this is actually neutral, and thus other speakers' deviation from this ideal is what makes them feel a little bit warmer. After all, John Atkinson of Stereophile says that it's the, and I quote, "best measuring loudspeaker I have encountered." And he's encountered quite a few. The question then is whether this maniacal pursuit of technical perfection correlates with maximizing pleasure. After all, we don't have daylight-esque 5600 Kelvin color temperature bulbs at home, despite the superior color fidelity that they provide, but rather the far less color accurate but warmer and cozier 2700 Kelvin. Sometimes more detail isn't the path to pleasure. In some ways, the revealing light cast onto the music by the system fosters a different kind of listening. For wallowing in texture and precision, detail, and dynamics, they are utterly phenomenal. I've always loved impossible sounds, to hear things that can't occur in nature, which is why I'm so enamored by electronic music. And Autiker's music, repping them on the t-shirt today, is extremely alien within all of electronic music. And it sounds like it's made for these exact speakers. For example, this 2022 Helsinki live set is incredible. The reverb retrieval is exponentially better than anything else I have ever heard. Like, that is a bold sentence, but I stand by it. It's not just like the amount and the trail length of reverb either, but their color and texture and like dimensionality. It's like an entirely new layer of the music has been made available. Like, even with drum and bass, with extremely tightly edited sampled drum hits mangled through some low resolution sampler, I can sense a tiny little glimpse of the reverb that each fraction of a second snippet used to carry. A different, but related qualities that some records that I had mentally flagged as a bit dull and uninteresting suddenly showed a lot more nuance than I knew was there. Wah Wu Wei's 108 Dimensions of Green went from "I should not have bought this" to "I can't wait to play it again and again." This incredible detail retrieval carries over to low volume performance, as you would expect, which has made me listen at quieter levels with these than in a very long time. But I might not have realized this if I hadn't measured the levels regularly. It felt like it was loud enough. I didn't have the key 3s here for a direct comparison, but I'm confident that they're at least as good at low-level playback as those, which means absolutely world-class. It is truly incredible to experience how much detail and clarity remains even at like 45 to 50 dB listening levels. But like most of us, I do get a desire for loud sounds sometimes. It's just that the clarity here is so staggering that loudness is never needed in order to hear more. Sometimes the desire isn't though for more detail, but for a greater sense of the air being sort of jam-packed with sound. When cranking it up, the resolution can become sort of sensorially overwhelming, as if my input bandwidth isn't sufficiently broad, at least before I acclimatize. This isn't listening fatigue, by the way, which was never once a problem with these, but more like my brain is understaffed to handle the torrent of oral input. A track that I did play loud and that proved to be incredible through these is Yodok's 2 from the album 4, I guess, or line from line. As usual, when I recommend stuff, it's not for the musically conservative or loudness adverse listeners. Oh, and don't try to buy the CD from Bandcamp. Mine never came and the label seems to have vanished, so that money is gone. The purity and ability to diminish first reflection smearing, thanks to the strong directivity, means that harsher sounds like metal and really noisy electronic stuff works extremely well. Though, I will say, some may prefer a denser sound. Nothing ever feels completely jam-packed here since the speakers so effortlessly untangle everything. And sometimes the allure of a wall of sound kind of mix is to feel that density, how everything is pushed to its limit. It's just that there's no limit to be found here. I find that modern productions are often a little bit richer and fuller thanks to better processing tech and recording and mixing and mastering, even when the output is measurably as dynamic as older productions. This fits these speakers well because not even black hole densities can overwhelm them. Older music where the recording, mix, and mastering quality wasn't pushed as far as today's technology allows still sounds fantastic if all of those things were done well. However, with some technically mediocre recordings, I found myself longing for a more forgiving presentation. An insufficiently well-recorded or processed hi-hat is revealed to sound anemic and unrealistic. A synthetic reverb has its unrealistically excited high end presented as the intrusively noisy mess that it is. But perhaps most of all, excessive compression felt more obvious than in any other speakers I've had in here. Maybe because there's so extremely little compression or overshoot in the speakers themselves, or maybe it's something to do with that infinite resolution. But then again, some deliberately muddled and obscure soundscapes proved deeply rewarding, like the ritualistic magic of Troom's outer brain outsourcing from Akuasme. Sometimes the sound of a speaker can draw you into music that you hadn't fallen for before. With these, I ended up removing some stuff from my Discogs want list. Whether that's a negative or not is kind of a glass half full or half empty question, but I thought it was an interesting observation that they revealed some music not to be worth pursuing physical copies of. On piano music, the LS1Cs don't have the problems I felt were present with the Key 3, despite the perceived brightness and ultra clarity of these speakers. The metallic ringing of piano strings is presented very clearly, but never exaggerated or malformed. Bill Lawrence's Lumen album, released in September, sounds absolutely incredible here, though I ordered it on vinyl just because I still feel that that's somehow the real physical format. A weird phenomenon that I've known from my Focal speakers, but I haven't really heard manifest as clearly through others, is how the tempo, or BPM, sounds extra evident. What I mean by that is a slow track sounds slower and a fast track sounds faster, and I can more easily tell the tempo difference between two tracks played consecutively. Maybe I care about these kinds of things since I've been DJing on and off for something like 3 decades, but regardless, I don't have a satisfactory explanation for how a speaker can accentuate this sensation. I understand it sounds incredibly weird to someone who hasn't experienced it, but the Grimm speakers do this at least as well as the Focals. Another interesting sensation with these is that when I pause mid-track, I feel like I take headphones off. It's as if I emerge from having been somewhere else, in some other world that vanished in an instant when I paused. Yes, other speakers can lean into this for sure, but it's extra powerful here. In the Sigberg Audio Sorana review, I spoke a lot about immersion, and that stuff is present here too, but this feeling of almost being teleported when I hit pause is different, as another layer or another flavor of immersion. I said earlier I'd be listening to them as a two-way system without subs first. The manual claims that, and I quote, "The standard two-way LS1 configuration can reproduce a full range of sound at adequate levels for most music." And, well, everything I've just said is true when running them without subs. After reviewing such bass competent speakers previously, I braced for a sort of thin and compromised lower octave here. But the LS1Cs on their own is almost shockingly viable as a complete system. Yes, of course the subs make a meaningful difference and did better at 13,000 euro, but much more in terms of SPL capacity than frequency extension. At regular listening levels, the woofer in the main body of the speakers can output way more bass than I could have expected. Yeah, you're not getting linear response to the lower limit of human hearing without the subs, but the roll-off is so elegant that this doesn't stand out at all. One thing that became evident though is that as you approach louder levels, so once you exceed 82 to 85 dB maybe, depending on the type of music you're playing, there is some audible distortions from the woofer when there are super low frequencies. It is very often masked by harmonics in the bass sound itself or by other instruments in the mix, but in very minimalist and bass-heavy music, such as that by Ile, I have no idea how you pronounce it, or some stuff by Oren Ambarchi, both of which approach test tone territory but make it far more musically intriguing, the woofer's limitations are quite audible. After I spotted this when playing music, I switched to playing some like 30 and 20 hertz sine waves, and now the overtone resonances from the woofer became completely obvious. The addition of these distortions actually means that bass content is more audible without the subs. It even measures several dB louder when I play the 30 hertz test tone, but that extra output is of course not the fundamental frequency, and it could also be different room interactions since the LS1c woofer sits higher up than the sub. Importantly though, this distortion in the very lowest bass mostly just sounds the way normal speakers do, and I didn't fully understand that until I compared it with the subs. Adding the SB1 subs lets the main body woofer roll off much higher, which lets it play cleaner with less distortion and do so at louder levels. It also lets the system play deeper overall, but on most music this isn't very obvious because even with bass-heavy electronic music, most of that bass sits above 30 Hz. So the effect is not really more bass at all, and at regular listening levels, with the majority of the hundreds of hours of music I listen to through these, the difference is genuinely difficult to hear. But when the recording quality, the playback level, and the frequency depth all line up, the bass with the SB1 subs is by a considerable margin the cleanest I have ever heard. I was genuinely not aware that bass could sound this clean and non-boomy in a regular room. This also makes it feel much leaner than from other speakers, and combined with the crazy resolution, sounds appear to have less density and heft than with the Dutch and Dut HC and the Sigberg Audio Sorana, even with the SB1s active. The SB1 bass also shares the sense of infinite resolution that the main speakers have, and I guess in infinite space, any mass is relatively infinitely small. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm keeping it in. Whether this bass behavior is a good thing will depend a lot on your preferences, but over time, as I gradually acclimatized to this very unique sound, I enjoyed it more and more. So if you addition these speakers, your first impression might be, whoa, this is too different. But give it time if you can, because you might simply not be used to hearing bass this clean and controlled. This incredible cleanliness of sound can likely be attributed to the motion control feedback system in the subs, where an acceleration sensor and digital processing corrects the movement of the woofer in real time. The slightly lower cost LS1s subs do not have this technology built in. Grimm are renowned for their ultra-high precision clocks and now also the DAC in the MU2. But the LS1c speakers, despite being the flagship, don't actually use the major DAC that is in the MU2. I'll poke Elko Grimm about this a little bit in my review with him, which I'll record right after recording this, but will say that I feel like there is some small degree of like elusive sonic sorcery and enchantment that the MU2 brought to my own system that doesn't quite manifest here. This, by the way, is in the context of the LS1c being better at practically everything else though, but at this price level I think you should be splitting hairs, and that is my impression. Of course, I'm not able to compare the speaker's internal DAC to anything else since it can't be bypassed. But it does a great job even with my cheapest digital source, the Argon Solo Roon endpoint. Like with the Sigberg Soranas, I still prefer the analog out of my MU2 over this, but by a slightly bigger margin here actually. The LS1Cs do run Grimm's renowned clocks internally, so I think incoming digital receives some degree of jitter cleanup, but you can still push things a little bit further by using the MU1. The MU1 is a Roon server. They're not calling it Roon Core anymore, so I'm trying to unlearn that terminology. With optional internal storage, a remote control, and a web interface that lets you access many of the settings of the LS1 speakers. Its output are digital only, but clocked with extreme precision and using a proprietary and highly advanced upsampler. It's hard to judge the value of this product as a whole since it depends so much on how it's used in a system. But yes, it does cost much more than some other Roon servers. And also, yes, some DACs have fancy internal reclocking and upsampling that makes the MU1's contribution a little bit smaller. And a third yes, the sound quality contributions from this very last percent of refinement are quantitatively small. So I think this is a product for those that already have everything else in order, which is also why I'm talking about it last. When connected to the LS1Cs, the MU1 increased relaxation and ease versus the MU2's analog outputs by some fractional but noticeable degree. Like with the qualities of the MU2, over time this manifests more clearly, much like how the benefits of an exercise program aren't felt on day one the way they are after year one. Small effects compound over time. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what is changing in order to give those impressions, but for example, I noticed I enjoyed louder playback a little bit more with the MU1, not just in a single occasion either, but throughout the review period. Like the MU2 that I already own, it is pricey, but it also buys you a digital music interface that is as close to perfect as I've found so far, and peace of mind about technical performance and reliability. Yes, you can MacGyver a Roon server and upsampler out of spare computers, but I for one am happy to have moved away from that. And I'm not a technophobe either. I have at least 5 computers in this room alone, but I'm happy it's not 6. So if I own these speakers, I would almost certainly set my sights on getting an MU1 eventually, both for interface and sound quality reasons, but you can do very well without it for several years as you heal the financial wounds of the speaker purchase. With these speakers, we're back to vinyl being more pleasurable than digital, for me. I feel like the qualities of my vinyl setup are in fuller bloom here than with any of the prior speakers in this series. The richness of color and emotion is incredibly another step above the Sigberg Audio Seranas, for example. I also found that with vinyl, the sound was more forgiving and accommodating for less than perfect recordings. Maybe this is in part influenced by my expectations of vinyl sound, but it's as though a really lush analog signal both counteracts the technical perfection and studio monitor tendencies and also flourishes thanks to those attributes. Just like a painting can convey a lot with just a few brushstrokes, some systems are less resolving but provide just the right scaffolding for your brain to fill in the gaps in a way that can be super satisfying. At the other end of the spectrum are systems that provide such a torrent of sensory stimuli that you feel like it's impossible to take it all in. This can be satisfying in a completely different way, like the first time you visit New York City or the first time you see the starry sky without light pollution. I feel like the Grimm LS1cs are in this latter end of the spectrum. These are, for lack of a better word, unforgiving. A couple of bad recordings that I have still enjoyed musically were genuinely difficult to derive pleasure from here, since their shortcomings were so ruthlessly revealed. It is my experience that a speaker can be very resolving without as much of this effect if there's some degree of coloration, serendipitously or through deliberate voicing from its designers. During my time with them, I've come to think of the LS1Cs as the ultimate reference system. Not reference components, because I can't switch its amplifiers or DACs, but a reference sound. That doesn't mean it's always and in every context the most desirable sound, but one against which everything else can be judged and calibrated. If I owned these, and a man can dream, right? I think I would also want a secondary system that leans into voicing and coloration for when I want to indulge in something that unapologetically deviates from strict linearity. But a maximally resolving speaker with this amount of fanatical devotion to linearity and elimination of distortions, which is necessary to lift its glass ceiling of performance with the very best recordings, simply won't have any mercy to spare for flawed recordings. A valid interpretation of that is that you need to consider how far you want the glass ceiling lifted considering your sonic preferences. But the thing about these is that the glass ceiling of performance potential isn't just lifted, it's shattered. It's gone. Or at least it feels gone relative to almost everything else I've ever heard. If your musical dietary constraints prescribe only high-end productions, and if you're a lover of detail and texture, this is Shangri-La. With the very best recordings, something happens here that I don't quite know how I can go through the rest of my life not having access to. I've only had this feeling once before in my life, and that's when I got into high-end in the first place. I now had to stop recording this review because very shortly I'll be doing an interview with Elko Grimm, the founder and CEO of the company, about these speakers and also about their other products and philosophy as a company. By the time you see this, that interview should be out as well. Normally, I end each of these by showing what product I'll review next. And I actually have two things in here for review, but neither is an active speaker. And I'm not quite ready to talk about them for reasons that will become clear later. I will, however, make a sort of summary video going through my lessons learned and sort of trying to tighten down what my takeaways are from reviewing these four different, sometimes very different active loudspeakers. That will come probably sometime during March. And either way, if you subscribe, which costs you nothing, you won't miss what is coming up. Thank you as always ever so much for watching. Bye.